Given the urgency of the situation, Nietzsche does not question in a sufficiently originary fashion. From Heidegger's 38-39 lectures, part of his conclusion after his thoughtful thinking through Nietzsche's second essay. He makes some other remarks on the lines of Nietzsche has brought us to the end of metaphysics. Nietzsche has not brought us to the new beginning. So Heidegger is trying to write on a sticker crisis, and stick it on the world. We have talk of the crisis from other sources that we can look at. It's convenient to be able to look at the great philosophers, if only in the sense, besides from their greatness, besides from them participating in greatness, that's what they're doing. Also because we can say this is what this great thinker thought, and we can avoid the question of whether it's true or not. We can hold that in suspense. We don't have to be immediately involved in a contentious situation where all we care about is our own view, and we put ourselves forward as debaters on the issue. We can try to think, but on the other hand, in thinking thoughtfully with Heidegger and coming towards Dasein, we may come into the situation of the genetic circle, whereby we'll be unable to read Nietzsche in any other way than the way Heidegger has shown us, and not only because we superficially have come over to be trained to do it that way, like a dog in a servile way, like as it were, some rule, or because we're part of a group and everybody has to say the same thing, but because our being will have to change, and it will either seem to us to be that way, but if we really go over to Heidegger, we'll have opened up the questioning. So some more comments from what he says. We're trying to get to do a little Propaedeutic on what the crisis is. What's this crisis all about? Is the human being merely something present, something ascertainable? Again, the theory of the object. Again, metaphysics in the Western tradition. What is the human being, and how is it? What is the point to appealing to quote-unquote needs if the essence of the human being remains undetermined, if it does not even feel the need to question its essence? So Heidegger speaks of it's not only that we're as yet unable to pose the question adequately, but it's even that we don't feel the need to do so concerning the crisis. And yet he says, given the urgency of the situation, Nietzsche does not question in a sufficiently originary fashion. We're falling into the abgrund, into the abyss. Nietzsche too speaks of the abyss, but from Heidegger's point of view, not from the radical position, genuinely thought into the opening out of Dasein, of being under the rubric human being, the rational animal. Heidegger says, we would do well to remark that in this essential determination of the human being, it is not simply equated with the animal. Rather, and much more significantly, animality is posited as the generic realm within which the essence of the human being within which the essence of the human being right up to the present day we have failed to think through this. So it's been posited as the realm of the essence of the human being, but since the beginning of the tradition we failed to think through this positing. And yet the destiny of the historical Occident, of its sciences, of its worldviews, and the faith of its churches is decided by either posing the question of the dividing line between the animal and the human being, or avoiding it. So I think so. This is neat. Of course, Nietzsche is posing this question in his way, in his own way, but he's apparently it's inadequate to the urgency of the situation. Um, and one can see that in a sense, in that Nietzsche doesn't grasp the bearing of the question of Dasein. Um, his questioning is radical, but it doesn't. It remains as though within a universe where there's creatures that are remote and where myths are put forward as forms, where emotion is read into these myths and they take over as the history within a region where one must yet appeal to the unpretentious truths in order to ground one's reflections, and most of all the unpretentious truth that Nietzsche poses that the past, what's happened in the past, cannot be undone. So we have in the analytic philosophy tradition all kinds of questions that are intelligible, but they don't meet the unpretentious truth requirements. So, for instance, the Mandela effect, or the South African uh, leader Mandela, the Mandela effect. Where it's believed that the things that happened in the past can be changed. That would go. That's intelligible. We can understand what the claim is in that concept, but it will go beyond the unpretentious truth. So Strauss, when Strauss approaches the crisis, he thinks of it almost. I'm tempted to say an identity to the power of the fact-value distinction, which he glosses as coming in around 1900, and you can look at Arnold Brecht's, or Arnold Brecht's, the German jurist Arnold Brecht, who wrote this book under the aegis of the New School, I guess sometime after the war, called Political Theory. There you can see when the fact-value distinction rose into power in the universities, and the practical effect that had in terms of destroying the gods, as it were. So far as I can see, when Heidegger speaks of the gods, he means what one could otherwise call the values. So I mean that we refuse that slavery is considered to be wrong. That's a god. Habeas corpus is a god in the Western tradition, even if it's primarily issued out of England, let's say out of the Magna Carta, or supposedly is. The freedom of conscience, the prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, which have been unrecognizable to the Romans or to antiquity in general. Lincoln got in some trouble over the habeas corpus issue of suspending that during the Civil War. The Chinese don't seem to have it as part of their canon of gods, as it were. So the fact-value distinction in this sense means that the sciences don't deal with the gods anymore in this sense. And so at first this seems unimportant, but as Brecht tells us, what the result was is because these things are no longer studied as the scientific way in the universities, they all fell into question in the general consciousness. So in the citizens' understanding, there's this possibility of going in. You have to deliberately go in one way or another. So that's part of the reason why the left-right distinction breaks down. And our people challenge it lately because you have to deliberately say we're going forward as a project, uphold these values, even though we know, and this is itself becomes a kind of innovation to deliberately uphold things that were in the past taken for granted as genuinely scientifically as knowledge. Now they have a status which is unclear to us. On the other hand, everywhere it's felt the notion of just because things were done in the past, we don't have to do them this way in the future. Radical revision, the so-called deviance as a way of life, Don Quixote, and so on. This is part of what's tagged the crisis. In Husserl, you can read Husserl's final book on the crisis of the European sciences, which go into this more deeply. If you think about it from Heidegger's point of view, ultimately we're going to be driven to the deeper questions. So I was thinking of the this issue of the empiricism. So it's not just that empiricism, there's different forms of empiricism. In a way, phenomenology is a form of empiricism. There's the empiricism of Carl Jung dealing with inner things. There's also the experimental empiricism, which is the most, which brings, in a way, highlights the issue of the theory of the object as metaphysics. So, for instance, the great power of anybody who does neurobiology, for instance, takes for granted that what we're looking for is in the brain things that show the causal mechanisms that have an appearance externally. For every appearance, there should be something happening in the brain that corresponds to it. The causal search. The causal search is causality in this sense is opposed to the gods or to teleology or to the human being, as it were, in the older sense. But the radical uselessness of this comes through in the Dasein thinking when we begin to think thoughtfully about Dasein. For instance, just the observation that the exact same things happening to all appearance, says a murder, for instance, can also be a heroic act, depending on the context, depending on what world we're in. And if you think about this in terms of, say, the Druids who worshipped the oak tree, as I've heard that they did, or in any case, revered the oak tree, or this was of unparalleled importance to them. This whole context of the comes into the question of the enigmatic nature of our destiny as beings, which was in former times experienced as knowledge, the gaining of knowledge of the oak tree, as it were, for the Druids. But for us, it's become more so conscious and down even to the most basic level, where the questioning can reach below, for instance, the biologists don't question the concept of causality. They don't drill into that like Schopenhauer did in his early essay, The Fourfold Roots of the Principle of Reason, his, as it were, his graduate work, which is some of his, which is on parallel in his career, I would say, to Heidegger's Being in Time, in the sense that it's, I suppose when people are doing work that is highly supervised and they are concerned with the result and how their peers whether they'll get a promotion, whether they'll get a degree for it, sometimes it makes them right in a way that is more generally popular. So, I mean, Heidegger's Being in Time is more popular than his other books in a sense, and people all the time say it's his magnus opus. But is that really so? It was something that was written under the pressure of his getting the ordinary at the full professorship. Let's go on about the crisis in the next video.